Charles Chauvel.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to say a few words on the third reading of these bills. First of all, really to echo the comments that were made by my friend and colleague David Parker, who found it somewhat ironic that, notwithstanding the difficult economic conditions the country finds itself in, then in the words of the Minister, we are now nearing the conclusion of the government's largest package of economic measures to be passed in this Parliament. And it is telling that those measures relate to the regulation of financial markets rather than to the stimulation of the economy, a real missed opportunity as far as the current circumstances are concerned by this government. Notwithstanding those words, it is worthwhile recounting the history of these measures. The program of reform that the Minister is now starting to bring to a close was begun obviously under the previous government, and I think it is important that people understand that this series of reforms, which is supported on this side of the House, is supported because it does represent important institutional reform. When the last government was in office, there was a recognition of the need to strengthen regulation in this area. And a number of the measures that were taken at that time included regulations giving trustee companies robust powers to supervise finance companies on behalf of investors, allowing criminal prosecutions against finance companies that had misled investors to be funded from the Securities Commission's litigation fund, making the Reserve Bank the prudential regulator for non-bank deposit takers. Finance companies are the classic example of those sorts of entities. Regulating financial advisors and financial service providers. The reviews of financial products and providers and financial intermediaries that were commenced in 2004 and 5 to improve the regulation of non-bank financial institutions, financial products and financial advisors. Amending the Securities Act to strengthen rules around insider trading and market manipulation, and passing securities markets legislation which introduced a co-regulatory framework for supervising registered exchanges. So, sir, that was the beginning of much of this work. The Minister deserves credit, as I said earlier, for bringing a significant part of the continuation of that work through the House and to a conclusion, and as I said, that is why those measures will be supported by members on this side. I was amused to hear the Deputy Chairperson of the Commerce Committee talk about how hard that committee had to work. That is a natural consequence of having to deal with levels of reform of this magnitude and detail. Similar experiences would be reported by the chairs of the Finance and Expenditure Committee and the Commerce Committee in the last term of Parliament, and that's as it should be. These measures do require careful scrutiny. They are of wide-ranging import, and if they're going to work, if they're going to be fit for purpose, then they do need that level of scrutiny, and that is the job of committees and of this House. And I do acknowledge the work that's been done in the Commerce Committee by all the members of that committee, including its chair, Leanne Dalzell. I think she feels some level of satisfaction that she's able, on that side of the ledger, as it were, to watch the present Minister complete a series of important institutional reforms begun on her watch. And so I pay tribute to both of them for that. But the truth is, as David Parker put it, that the real job of broadening and deepening financial markets in New Zealand is only partly going to be accomplished by having good housekeeping on the regulatory front. Of course we don't want to see the sort of nonsense that's gone on around finance company failures and the other sorts of, frankly, predatory behaviour that we've seen on what is classically referred to as mum and dad investors. There should be an environment that stops that sort of thing from happening. But there also need to be markets. And the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which the previous government set up, which sadly has been diminished by the current administration as far as ongoing contributions are concerned, and the KiwiSaver scheme, again something that was cut by the incoming government at a time when actually some stimulus would have been a useful thing, are two very, very good examples of substantive policy initiatives of the type that we need to see in this country if we are going to get out of recession and start growing the economy again. Those are the sort of policies that we need in addition to this sort of good housekeeping. Now, Sarah, a couple of words around the housekeeping itself. As has been said in speeches during the course of the passage of this legislation, this is good legislation, but there are some areas where it could be improved. I heard the Minister yesterday in the House during the committee stages talk about how important it was to have the Financial Markets Authority in place as a comprehensive regulator across the sector, and I agree with him on that point. But we shouldn't mislead ourselves that, for example, in the case of criminal behaviour or in the case of fraud, that the FMA will be able to call all the shots. Obviously, the Serious Fraud Office in particular will have an overlapping jurisdiction in certain cases. When the Serious Fraud Office decides to investigate, then frankly the FMA and other bodies will just have to stand aside. In criminal investigations, that's the way it works. And I do think it's important to observe that this is a general problem that we seem to have in a country as small as New Zealand. We often have overlapping regulatory and criminal oversight responsibilities divided between different bodies. It might well have been a good idea to have extended the FMA's powers into the criminal sphere so that when there was some case of suspected serious fraud, they would actually have a power to deal with that matter to the exclusion of the Serious Fraud Office. As it is, there is still the overlapping jurisdiction, and we will still see in the future cases where investors are burned through unfair and fraudulent behaviour and where the FMA is unable to act because the SFO will actually step in and there will be a criminal investigation for a period, and there will be frustrations and annoyance justifiably as a result of that overlap. It's something that we ought to have fixed up by now. The other concerns, I think, around the way in which we have set up the regulatory oversight regime here were pointed out by Leanne Dalzell in one of her speeches in the committee stages when she tabled a supplementary order paper which would have actually had the Financial Markets Authority enabled to issue statements of principle in broad brush terms along the lines of the Financial Services Authority's powers in the UK. And then market participants would have to comply with those principles. Instead, we've gone for a much more compliance-based approach to the delight, I'm sure, of my former profession and of the accounting profession. And we will have to see which approach in practice works out best for participants in the market. The other two things I wanted to say by way of foreshadowing the sort of watching brief that I think needs to be kept on this legislation are that we still don't have in this country a single body responsible for promoting financial literacy. And until we have that body, and I'm pleased to see the Minister nodding because I think it is something that again we could agree across the House and try to deal with on a priority basis. You can have all the regulation and all the enforcement in the world. You can even have the best functioning capital markets in the world, which we're still away from, I'm afraid. And until you have the ability of people to invest on a confident basis because they actually understand the products that they're investing in, you're going to have a problem. So the final word, it's great that we've regulated comprehensively at the upper and the middle end of the markets. We haven't yet dealt comprehensively with those payday lenders, those loan sharks. They are preying on people in a particularly distressing way. Another part of the watching brief that we'll be keeping, sir, will be how this Parliament reacts to the problem that they present to the market. It isn't yet sufficiently dealt with in these reforms, and it needs to be.
I call the honourable member